I'm Carol Powell, and I'm a member of the Volunteer Board of Directors of the Savannah Book Festival. And if you've attended this festival before, you'll probably think it's a little extraordinary that the board member would be standing here between you and the author that you really want to hear. But I'm here because of extraordinary circumstances. All of us have felt the impact of inflation, and the Savannah Book Festival has not been spared. Nearly 90% of the festival's income is from sponsorship and donations, and that generous support has allowed us to provide the festival for free for the last 16 years. But this year, the cost to put on the festival has increased significantly, while our income has stayed the same. Unfortunately, this is not sustainable for us, so we're asking for your support. Each year, we have little yellow buckets in the backup for donations, and they're here again this year, along with a Venmo account to make it even easier by scanning the QR code on the back of your program. So if you enjoy the festival Saturday just like it is, with dozens of speakers in many venues, all day long for free, please consider a gift. It will make a significant difference. Thank you. And P.S., I had the honor of having lunch with Louis Bayard yesterday, and I promise you're in for a treat.
Isn't Cara Powell just a wonderful person? I think she is. Hello, everyone. Good morning. My name is Roger Smith, and I'm a volunteer for the Savannah Book Festival. I don't know about you, but I'm delighted to be here with you in year 16. I was here in the very first year, and a lot of years in between, so it's amazing that we are here in the blink of an eye at year number 16. This year's festival is presented by the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, by David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation. And with special thanks to Georgia Humanities for a generous grant to make today possible as well. We're especially grateful to the Lemon Foundation for sponsoring this venue, First Baptist Church Sanctuary today, and that sponsorship is in honor of Carol and Joe Young. As Caro said, we'd like to thank and welcome all of our generous sponsors and literati members today. It is through their support and your support that we're able to make the festival events on Saturday free to the public. And indeed, 90% of the revenue comes from donors and literati members, so we're deeply grateful for that support. This year's festival is jam-packed full of great events and authors, and we don't want you to miss any of the events that you want to be sure to attend. So we would recommend that you download the Savannah Book Festival's app on your cell phone, and then you can be in the know about all of the events of the weekend. And if you need more information about how to download that app, you can consult the back of your printed program for information. Before we get to the real reason that you're in First Baptist Church today, I want to cover a couple of housekeeping details with you. First of all, our featured author today, Louis Bayard, will be signing the books of his that you purchased at the festival in the tent in Telfair Square immediately following this presentation. If you're planning to stay for the next author, then we would ask that maybe you would show the courtesy of people who are coming in by moving up toward the front so that we'll have adequate seating toward the back. This would be a wonderful time for you to have a quick look at your cell phone to make sure that it is either turned off or at least turned to the silent position so that we won't have interruptions of the electronic variety. This is very important. On the back of your program, you're going to see a QR code while you've got your phone in your hand. You could take a moment to share your opinion about your experiences at the Book Festival this weekend and today. This survey is important in communicating to Book Festival planners any improvement or impact that the festival has on the city of Savannah, and it is extremely important to ongoing funding from our grant-related sources. You will have the opportunity at the conclusion of our author's prepared remarks to ask questions and have those questions answered, but we do ask that you hold your questions or comments until the end. And to make sure that you can be heard throughout the space, one of our volunteers will come to you with a microphone. And I'll repeat this in just a second when we get to this point in the program, but I would ask that your questions be succinct and terse and to the point, and that you refrain from telling long stories or making statements so that we can have the maximum number of questions and answers in the time that we have together today. Our author, Louis Bayard, is with us today courtesy of Jean and Will Holland, as well as through the generosity of Morgan Kuhn. And now, introducing our author. Louis Bayard is a New York Times notable book author and has been shortlisted for both the Edgar and Dagger Awards for his historical thrillers, which include titles such as The Pale Blue Eye and Mr. Timothy. A recent novel of his, the critically acclaimed Courting Mr. Lincoln, has been picked up by Netflix for a film that will be starring Christian Bale. Today's book, about which he'll be speaking, is called Jackie and Me, and I encourage all of you to pick up a copy if you haven't done so already. I know that you will all want to join me in giving a very warm Savannah Book Festival welcome to our presenting author today, Louis Bayard.
Gosh, hello Savannah. This is lovely. What a lovely space, and it's so nice to see all these carbon-based life forms out there. You know, this book tour was the first. I was one of the first authors to go back into the wild after COVID, and I was always wondering if anyone would be there to greet me on the other side. So it's really so nice to see you all, and it's so nice to be in Savannah, a town I first learned about. I won't sing the song, but I'm tempted. Hard-Hearted Hannah. The Vamp of Savannah, G.A., has one of my favorite lines. I saw her at the seashore with a great big pan. There was Hannah pouring water on a drowning man. I think that's as good as poetry gets, in my opinion. So great to be here, and so great to meet Caro, who took us to the Chatham Club yesterday. What a lovely experience, and we made some lovely friends there. And thank God for friends, because one of the things I forgot to pack for this trip was a copy of my own book. So thank you. Thank you, Anne, for having one to refer to. This is what it looks like, in case you've forgotten. And since I have it up here, I just want to acknowledge somebody whom I've never met, is the illustrator of this cover. Her name is Sarah Singh. As a bookseller told me, this cover pops, and it does. Embarrassingly, though, the first time I saw it, an earlier version of it, I was like, are you sure? Because until then, my book covers, if you've seen them, they all could be the same cover. It's a 19th century man in a top hat looking away from the viewer. In Courting Mr. Lincoln, oh, by the way, the Netflix movie is of The Pale Blue Eye. I was a miscommunication on my part. It's The Pale Blue Eye. Check it out. It's about Edgar Allan Poe at West Point, and it's Edgar Allan Poe origin story starring Christian Bale and Gillian Anderson, Robert Duvall. It's definitely worth your time. But anyway, so all the covers kind of look the same. Except for Lincoln, it's a 19th century woman facing away from the viewer, looking at two men in top hats, also looking away from the viewer. So they're very discreet and traditional, and they don't affront the reader. And then comes along this delightfully forward feminine cover. And it's like, are you sure this is for me? Something, of course, I was wrong. And something else I was wrong about, the ampersand. Now, this is the first title of mine that has the word "and" in it, and I naively assumed it would be spelled out. But then I was told, authors get told a lot of things, that it would look better in lipstick with an ampersand, and once again they were correct. So this is conclusive proof that I should never self-publish. I don't have that skill set at all. All I knew how to do is just disgorge acres of prose and let other people reckon with the consequences of that. And I hope to do that until they tell me to stop. So I think even if I took my hand now and covered this delightful rendering and just gave you this name, Jackie, I think you'd still know who I was talking about, right? That name usually triggers one association. And the only remaining question is, which Jackie are we talking about? Is it the first lady in the pillbox hat? Is it the beautiful widow with the two young children? Is it the wife of the Greek tycoon? Is it the professional book editor that she became ultimately? Is it the paparazzi magnate, familiar to so many generations of tabloid readers, and I was certainly one of those? Is it the style icon? So many avenues into one enduringly mysterious woman. But I took the road less traveled by. This is the Jackie before she became any of those Jackies. So let's travel back in the historical novelist time machine. This is 1951. And Jackie has just graduated from college. Does anybody know where she graduated from? No, she spent 2 years at Vassar. She spent a year at the Sorbonne, but she finished out her college career at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., which was then a pretty low-profile commuter college in those days. But I happened to teach a class there, a fiction writing class at GW, and every time I go there, I walk past the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Hall, the building that's there in her honor. So she's just graduated, and she wants to be a journalist, and toward that end, she has earned the prestigious Prix de Paris scholarship with Vogue magazine, which was, I think, won 10 years later by Joan Didion, so very high-profile competition. That, for some reason, falls through, but then she rebounds and she wangles a job at the Washington Times-Herald, that was the Hearst paper of its day, as the inquiring camera girl. And in this capacity, she travels the streets of Washington, D.C., and this is 1950s D.C., right? So, as Kennedy would later say, a city of northern charm and southern efficiency. Yeah, and so she's in this kind of, it was a bit of a backwater. She's wandering the street. She's wearing heels and hose, pearls. She is carrying this heavy-ass Gravlax camera, and she's going up to random strangers. This is a man on the street enterprise. So she's going up to random strangers and buttonholing them and asking them prearranged questions like, what would be your last meal? Or do you think women are really the gentler sex? The kind of questions that are designed not to offend. Or then she takes down their answers. She takes their pictures. She goes back to the office, takes a cab back to the office, edits down the answers to 500 words, then develops the pictures herself. Her fingernails grow green over the course of her time there from the chemicals, and then submits the column, and she does this 6 days a week. So it's a real job, not a Pulitzer Prize winning kind of gig, but a job, and highly fitting for a young woman who, in her yearbook for Miss Porter's School for Girls, said that her goal in life was, quote, not to be a housewife. So that's the Jackie we meet here, and the narrator refers to her here. Oh God, where did it go? I had marked. Oh yes, the scrapping career girl with the homemade clothes and the ladders in her stockings and the childlike sense of the ridiculous. The girl whose skin broke out every so often, who doubted herself at every turn, who wasn't even sure she wanted to marry at all, certainly not the kind of man she was supposed to marry. The Jackie nobody else knew but me, really, and the Jackie who can no longer be. Well, the words can no longer be are a kind of provocation to an historical novelist, so it has been my pleasure and joy to try to imagine the Jackie who can no longer be and make her live once more. That is the hope, at any rate. So let's travel to the other side of the ampersand, to this me character, the narrator. It's maybe not the me you were thinking of. It's not John Kennedy, for sure. It's not Aristotle Onassis or Maurice Templeman or any of the men that she was romantically linked with. It's a gentleman by the name of Lem Billings. And if you don't recognize the name, well, neither did I until about 4 or 5 years ago when I got a copy of my college alumni weekly, which is confusingly a bi-weekly. I still haven't resolved that in my head. And on the cover was this rather startling picture of two young freshmen, Princeton freshmen from the 1930s. And they were posed in this fascinating way, very flirtatiously. I wish I could reproduce it for you. They have their hand on the back of their head and then their hand on a hip, and they kind of like a Mae West posture, if you can. And that's how they're, and it's as I said, very flirtatious. And my first thought, oh my gosh, these are two homosexuals from the 1930s who got captured, had their image captured on camera and then scurried back to safety. It just had that feeling of the forbidden. But then I looked at the smaller of the two young men, who was fair and rather slight and rather pretty and rather familiar. And the longer I looked at him, I realized I was looking at the freshman version of John F. Kennedy. Not the engraved figure we would recognize from the $50, but this liminal creature on the cusp of manhood. So that got my attention. And then also getting my attention was the other fellow in the picture. He was this tall, bespectacled fellow with an overbite and a goofy grin and this air of hilarity that decades later seems to be bursting through the frame of the picture. So began my introduction to Kirk Lemoyne Billings, whose main claim to renown in his own and everybody else's mind was being Jack Kennedy's best friend, from Choate through life. But my initial instincts were not completely off, because he was also a closeted gay man, or as they used to say in those days, a practicing homosexual. I always loved that phrase, because I thought, if they keep practicing, will they get better? Will they get better at him? I don't know, it worked for me. So as a practicing homosexual, Lem would have found connections wherever he could, in private settings, in public settings, hoping that the guy on the other end wasn't an undercover cop or a thug or someone who was going to rat him out a few days later or 3 decades later. He would have run the gamut of all those possibilities, and the book considers one of them at some length. But the more I learned about him, the more I realized his heart was reserved for just one man. When Jack Kennedy needed something, when Jack Kennedy needed someone to go with him on a tour of Europe after college, Lem was there. When Jack needed someone to help launch his congressional campaign, his first congressional campaign, his first presidential campaign, Lem was there for that too. And when Jack just needed perfect liberation, the freedom to call up somebody and bitch and moan and kibitz and shoot the shit or play backgammon or do nothing at all, Lem was always there to pick up that call. So when Jack needed somebody to befriend the new young woman in his life, a well-connected Catholic socialite named Jacqueline Bouvier, Lem was on board for that too. I imagine their first meeting happening on Chain Bridge. Jack has just picked up Jackie. They're supposed to meet his Bobby and Ethel that night. This is their first meeting with the Kennedys. Ethel was a bit of a fearsome creature to meet for the first time. But they're on their way there, and they're crossing over Chain Bridge back into D.C. Most of the book is set there. And Jackie rouses herself to ask, "Jack, what color is your car?" Queer question, says Lem, but then I realize she's never seen Jack's car, or Jack himself, maybe, in the naked light of day. "I don't know," he mumbles. "Red." "Pomegranate," I say. Something quickens in the column of her neck. By easy degrees, she turns around and bestows on me a fuller version of that first smile. Then she leans toward Jack and in whispers stagey enough for me to hear says, "I like your friend." And in fact, Lem was very fond of Jackie, and they would have had a lot in common. They were both, in their own way, outliers, people who grew up amidst great wealth without having a lot of their own. They were both aesthetes and Europhiles who cared a lot more about art than politics or touch football, for that matter. And they were both rather lonely people who both loved one man, perhaps a little too much, for their own benefit. Looking back on these events, Lem can't help but see all the roads less traveled by, all the things that might have gone differently if they had made different choices. For instance, Jackie is in love with another John, or actually a couple other Johns. At one point, she's engaged to a young stockbroker named Johnny Husted, until his mother finds out, Jackie's mother finds out that Husted doesn't have quite as much money as she thought. She's also in love with a John Marquand Jr., whose father was a celebrated novelist of that day, and who is trying to becoming the next great novelist of his generation in Paris. And Jackie very much wants to be his muse. So there are a lot of choices, different choices that she could have made. Speaking of choices, John F. Kennedy has no desire to be married. He is a very happy bachelor. And the only reason he is even thinking about this is because his father insists that a man can't be president without a wife. And that's still kind of true today. There's been one bachelor president. Can anyone name him? James Buchanan, right? Our only bachelor president. I think we still have a hard time with presidents who aren't married. So it's really a political calculus driving this. And Jackie herself has to decide if this is a family that she wants to get on board with. So finally, it's about two people, both of whom give over their lives to the Kennedys for a certain amount of time, and both of whom have a certain amount of regrets about that in the end. I see contingency at work in my own life. We discussed some of the other works. I made my name first as the author of sort of gothic thrillers like Pale Blue Eye and Mr. Timothy, which is about Tiny Tim from Christmas Carol all grown up and living in Victorian London. But then in the last few years, I've done a pivot away from mystery to the courtship novel, to Jane Austen and that we're in Henry James and that kind of world. It seems like a very different world, but there's still a mystery. The mystery is something that the historical record has fallen silent about. For instance, what brought Jack Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier together? How did these two very different specimens ever decide to tie the knot? And the thrill, if you like, becomes plumbing the historical record to find those secrets. And imagining your way into those rooms where nobody was around to report what was going on. So with that, how are we doing for time? We're good? Okay, okay. At this point, I'm sort of tired of hearing myself yak. Do people have any questions that they would like to toss my way? Okay, I see a hand there. I think there's a microphone coming to somebody. Somebody? Call the questions if you. Okay, good. And indeed, the microphone will come to you, so we've got somebody. Okay. Yeah.
Who is the person? Sure.
I think you said you met Lem Billings at one point, and is that right?
No, I did not.
Oh, okay.
But I met somebody who met him. I don't just yesterday, in fact. He died in 1981, which is I was just graduating from college, high school at that time. But I've talked to several people who have, and I've heard indirectly from his niece, who felt like it was a pretty persuasive and authentic portrait, which is interesting to me. Yeah, but you follow up?
I was going to ask what he actually told you, but
no.
What did you learn about him from the people you did talk to?
He left behind these interviews. He was interviewed, I think, shortly after Kennedy's death, along with a lot of other people, to create a kind of oral history of John Kennedy. And those interviews were, blessedly, digitized in the last few years, and they are on the JFK Library website. Very frank interviews, interestingly. He talks quite openly about Jack's philandering, about his habits, and he talks about the moment where he was asked by Jack to tell Jackie, in advance of the marriage, what she would have to expect. He was supposed to tell her that he was not about to be a faithful husband any more than Jack's father had been, and Lem was the one who was supposed to set her wise. I found that fascinating and really revealing of the relationship, Lem's relationship with Jack, and that he would be dispatched on such a delicate errand, and that also his closeness to Jackie. So that becomes a pivotal moment in the book itself, where he's tasked with doing that, telling her the truth of what she has to expect. And I won't tell you how it plays out in the book, but it plays out a little differently than it did in real life. Yes, over there. Oh, sorry. No.
Hi. I'm wondering if you've spoke with any of the Kennedys, Caroline, or if you heard from any of them.
I have not spoken with any of the Kennedys, nor have I heard from them. My feeling is that I'm told that Caroline doesn't read or watch anything about her parents. And I'd be surprised if any of the Kennedys do. I think so much has been written about them and done on TV and movies about them that I think if I were them, I would just ignore it. But it is interesting because it's the first book I've written that has people still alive in it. Usually I wait until people are safely dead so they can't sue me or anything. So in this case, the people who are still alive, Ethel Kennedy is still with us. Bobby Kennedy Jr. was very close to Lem Billings. I think a lot of the Kennedy children were. They would have called him Uncle Lem or something like that. He was such a presence at Hyannisport and Palm Beach and everywhere else. But no, I decided that because the book is set when it's set, mostly before they're even married, that I didn't know if the Kennedy children would have much to add to that. But I will say, too, that Lem had an interesting sort of second career himself as the surrogate father to that next generation of Kennedy children. He lived in New York, and he hosted them, particularly Bobby Jr., Chris Lawford, Tim Shriver. And he would, we would call him today an enabler, because not only did he overlook their rampant drug use, he actually indulged in it himself. They went around, scored heroin off of in Harlem. They took some very serious drugs, and Lem at the time was quite ill. He had asthma. He would die at 65. So this was an interesting choice for him to make, but he felt that he had to meet them where they were and also be their mentor so that they could be the next generation of leaders. That was his assumption. And all his hopes were placed in Bobby Jr. So when I see kind of some of the wacky positions that have emanated from that person lately, I feel like, oh, Lem would have been, my first thought is Lem would have been so disappointed. He thought Bobby Jr. was going to be the next great president. So.
Hi. How did you come up with the idea to write this book in this perspective, and how much of your book is based on actual fact?
I kind of described the origin of it. It really did start with Lem. I came to Jackie by way of Lem, and I just thought Lem was an interesting character because his story hasn't been told. It gets back to what I was saying earlier. The historical novelist goes in where the historical record falls silent, and Lem is this silent figure. He's a Zelig-like presence in a lot of White House photographs from the Kennedy administration, just wandering through. He's in the back of some ceremony in the Rose Garden or the Oval Office, just there to observe, but always in the background. And that's where he wanted to be. When Jack was elected president, Lem was offered the first directorship of the Peace Corps, as well as an ambassadorship, but he turned them both down because he thought that his job was to be first friend. That was his role. That was the service, the patriotic duty he could play. So by design, he lived a lot of his life in the shadows. And of course, as I said, as a gay man too, he would have been hiding a lot of that time. So he was the character who really fascinated me. And it was really just when I saw that he had a front row seat on the Jack and Jackie courtship that I thought this would be a wonderful tale to refract through his eyes. And also a way of looking at the cost of Camelot, right? On the people who had to toe the line there. So that's really where it came from. There was a second part to your question, which I forget. Oh, how much is based on fact and how much is based on fiction? I wish I could tell you, but I always start with fact, and then I let myself wander. For instance, that moment I was highlighting for you earlier where Lem is supposed to tell Jackie, set her wise about her future as Mrs. Kennedy. I go off on a slightly different tangent, just trying to imagine how that would have changed things. So again, it starts in fact, and then I just kind of give myself freedom to treat them essentially as fictional characters. Because that's the only way I think to make them live in the context of a novel, is to give them a kind of autonomy that history can't. Yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering, did Jackie and Lem stay close friends after her husband died?
That's a great question. Not as much. While Jack was alive, Lem was at the White House every weekend. He had his own room there. The Secret Service just waved him through each time. That's how present he was. But afterwards, not as much. In the 1970s, Jackie, it appears, began to pull her kids away from that whole Hyannisport axis. Because, as I said, a lot of that generation of Kennedys were getting in a lot of trouble. Legal trouble, academic trouble, drug trouble. And she didn't want them to be part of that world. And because Lem was part of that world, it does seem like there wasn't a lot of contact between them toward the end. And the book kind of alludes to that as well. I will say she did attend his funeral, which I think says something about the lingering value of that connection, and that his pallbearers were the Kennedy boys, the next generation of Kennedys. There's a funny story about that. Apparently the coffin had already been placed in the grave before they could get there. So they had someone lift it out of the grave just so they could walk it around a few times and say that they were Lem's pallbearers. But they were very devoted to him and to his memory. Yeah. Oh, is it? I'm just going to get there first. You're fine.
Thank you.
Did Lem have a profession from Princeton until Kennedy was elected? Did he ever work?
He did. That's a great question. In fact, he was proud of the fact that he had his own career, that he was financially independent of the Kennedys. They didn't pay his way. In fact, back when he would, when they invited him down to Palm Beach, and he was still a poor college student, a scholarship student, he would hitchhike down to get down to Florida because he couldn't afford a car or train or anything like that. But he eventually got work as an advertising executive for Emerson Drug Company in Baltimore, and his big account was, and their big product was Bromo Seltzer. So he was in charge of making commercials for Bromo Seltzer. He was also, some of you may know this, the father of the Fizzies. Does anybody remember Fizzies? Yes. He was the one who came up with the idea of, Bromo Seltzer was notoriously not pleasant to consume, so I think the idea was if you put some fruit flavoring in it or something that it becomes a nicer drink and kids will drink it and all those other things. I don't think Bromo Seltzer is made anymore, is it? I don't think so. Alka-Seltzer was the big rival. Then I think towards the end of his life he began refurbishing and flipping homes around in the Baltimore area, which is where he lived for a lot of his life. And then he ended up in New York, Upper East Side, Manhattan, and that's where he died. Bobby Jr. inherited his house after his death. So yeah, I think he was very proud of the fact that he had his own identity in the world. Another funny story, Lem was a very handsome dude, by the way, if you look at pictures of him. And at one point, somebody came up to him and offered him the job of being Marlboro Man, which he turned down, sadly. So interesting, he went from sort of herding talent to almost being a talent at one point himself. So, all right.
Just a quick question. Did Lem have a partner that was a known partner within the White House and what have you? Or?
No, not a known partner. I don't think he would ever have embarrassed the Kennedys by bringing a man friend to the beach with him. He would just discreet, but he definitely did have relationships. He had liaisons. People spoke of running into. Sometimes just somebody stumbling out of a bedroom one morning, So he was active, and apparently somebody once saw him in Grand Central Station, just kind of looking for men. So, but I think one of the things that appeals to me about both Jack and Jackie is they apparently knew he was gay, and it didn't bother them. They were very much live and let live. But that might have been tested if he brought somebody in. The word partner didn't even exist in that context in those days, of course. You weren't supposed to kind of marry anybody, for God's sake. Just do it on the sly. At any rate.
Hi, thank you for being here. I'm early into reading Jackie and Me, and the first few chapters you mentioned Janet quite a bit, Jackie's mother, and she does not come off very nurturing. What was that relationship like, and when you write, is a lot of that factual or of research you did? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for mentioning Janet Auchincloss. That is Jackie's mother. She was a formidable woman, and no, not a nurturer. Neither was Rose Kennedy, for that matter. Two fairly cold women. But Janet was a fascinating character. Her first husband was Black Jack Bouvier, whom Jackie resembled quite a bit. And he was a serious alcoholic and philanderer who ran through a lot of his family money. and slept with a lot of women. So that there was a very bitter divorce. But then Janet, rather than retreating, into maidenly solitude, went after set her cap for a Standard Oil heir named Hugh Auchincloss, with whom she managed to have 2 more children, even though he was functionally impotent. Apparently, that was the rumor. So she was a survivor, and she understood that a woman in those days of that society needed to marry well. It's the same imperative that drives Jane Austen and Eve Wharton heroines. That the idea that women didn't have the capacity, that it was much harder for them to have their own careers. So they had to find the right husband. And Janet, manifestly didn't the first time around, so she had to get it right the second time around. But as I said, Jackie, as a stepdaughter of the Auchinclosses, would not have inherited any of that wealth or any of those estates, including Hammersmith Farm, or the one in Northern Virginia, whose name I keep blanking on, Marywood, yes. I tried to visit it, but it's still private property. And unlike Douglas Preston from last night, I'm not gonna get police on my tail, just for a book, for God's sake. I was very impressed by his daring do. Yes.
Hi, I saw the movie, The Pale Blue Eye. It was very good.
Oh, thank you.
And so my question is about that. How is it having your book made into a movie? Did they give you the artistic license? I mean, or did they kind of rule over you and say, no, this is the way we want it made? Kind of thing?
Oh, that's a great question. I have to blame Scott Cooper, the writer-director, because I don't have a single Hollywood horror story to tell about that experience. I mean, if I went into a bar and told people how respectfully I was treated, no one would buy me a beer for that story. And the thing is, I was told from very early on, when an option is first taken on your book, an option is not a green light. It's just somebody saying, okay, we're going to take your book and try to make something happen. 99.9% of the time, it doesn't happen. And even if it does happen, you're told by the same people in the know that you will not be involved. They want you to just go away. They're going to throw some money at you and expect you to walk out the door. But then Scott Cooper called up and sent me the first draft of the script, and his parting words were tear it apart, and shared successive drafts of the script with me. So he was, to be clear, he was the screenwriter, but it was really quite faithful to the book in ways that I was very impressed by and touched by. And I didn't have to be included. That wasn't in the contract. He just did it because he wanted my input. So I'm very pleased with the final product. It's a beautiful film. It's very dark, very dark, and a very cold film. It's set in. It was filmed in Western Pennsylvania during the height of winter, and the actors are legitimately cold when you look at them. They are terribly cold. One of the actresses said she was never so glad to have a corset on than when she was wearing that. When she was in that movie. But it's a wonderful casting, including Gillian Anderson and Robert Duvall, and Timothy Spall. Wonderful, mostly British cast, interestingly enough. And then the young actor who plays Edgar Allan Poe is Harry Melling, who was best known until now as Dudley Dursley from the Harry Potter movies. But he's grown up and slimmed down, and he's a wonderful leading man and a wonderful Poe. I couldn't be happier about his performance in that part. Misappropriating is that I've seen it. Everybody should watch it. So I'm delighted. There we go. We have two thumbs up. Three thumbs up. Yeah. Oh, look at all the thumbs. Look at all the thumbs. That's almost 4 hands of thumbs. So.
Hi. Deeply appreciated the Pale Blue Eye, and yes, like you said, it was very the atmospheric. You felt like you stepped in the middle of winter. In New York, West Point. But I was wondering, as someone who lived in Virginia for many, many years until coming back home to Savannah, I was just wondering if you ran into any Virginians or any Edgar Poe scholars who gave you their opinion, who watched or read the book, watched the movie, and gave you an opinion what they thought of Edgar Allan Poe, because I thought Harry Mellon nailed it. It was jaw-dropping. I think, anyone who read his books or Edgar Allan Poe and the poetry and had any appreciation of Edgar Allan Poe, I just wondered if any Virginians or Edgar Allan Poe scholars weighed in on that. Thank you.
No, I have not heard from them. It's interesting to me, though. It's interesting you raise Virginia, because he grew up there. There was some controversy over what his accent would be. But my feeling, I think the consensus, is that he grew up in Virginia, in Richmond, and went to UVA for 6 months, and then so would have that kind of Tidewater accent. I think that was one of the things that Melling really nailed. I thought he got the accent just right. But it's interesting, too, is that, I could be wrong, by the way, if anyone's from Richmond and you want to quibble. Yeah? Oh, good. Also interesting, too, is he spent as much time at West Point as he did at UVA. UVA has a shrine, and his room is a shrine now. This is where Poe slept for 6 months. I think he had to leave because of gambling debts or something like that. He spent the same amount of time at West Point. There, at least when I last went there wasn't a sign of him there. He's not in the gift shop. He's not anywhere. And I think it's because they're embarrassed by him. He was this creepy guy who wrote creepy stories. He didn't become a great general. The only other guy they don't mention much is James Whistler, probably for similar reasons. He became this debauched artist. So those are the two West Point outliers that I'm most familiar with. Yeah, that's right there.
You spoke very eloquently about the gaps in history, the gaps in the historical record, and I was wondering if there was anybody or anything right now that is sort of sparking your interest for the future in terms of those gaps in the historical record?
That's a great question. I am enjoined from answering that question. I'm not supposed to talk about the thing I'm working on right now, except to say that it's going to be, I know. But I do want to talk more generally about where the historical record falls silent, and it so often is with women, with people of color, and with queer people. Those are the ones who weren't able to tell their stories for whatever reason. So it's really fun for me as a reader, not just a writer, sort of finding these people resurrected from history. But there are even parts of famous people's lives. My book, Courting Mr. Lincoln, for instance, is about the courtship between Lincoln and Mary Todd, but also about Lincoln's relationship with his best friend, Joshua Speed, a relationship about which historians have been speculating for some time, because it was very passionate in its own way. But again, nobody was in those rooms to see what was happening. So it was really a gas to sort of imagine my way and then figure out how that relationship would have played out, because at the same time he was courting Mary Todd, he was sharing a bed with Joshua Speed. And Speed himself would later say that no two men were closer than we were. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it was getting in the way of this courtship. And so it's a love triangle of sorts. And the kind of thing that, to the best of my knowledge, hadn't been told in fictional terms. The historians have been talking about it for a while. But again, because the freedom, the glory is that the novelist can speculate in a way that the historian can. So.
Hi, I was wondering about Lem Billings' relationship with Bobby Kennedy, because Bobby Kennedy was close to Jackie also, and did a lot of the cleanup to make sure things weren't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So were they as close? And did they both kind of participate in sort of protecting?
Yes. Yeah, it's funny, I heard Lem described once as Jack's fixer. I don't know if that accurately describes what he did, although he does talk in the book about escorting the girls, that last night's conquest out the door, finding a taxi for her. I think Bobby would have handled the high deal political kind of cover-ups. If, for instance, there was a cover-up around Marilyn Monroe, which I'm sure people have a lot of opinions about that, but that is something Bobby would have handled, or the mafia. Lem, and I don't think Lem would have had the ability or the insider knowledge about a lot of that stuff. Theirs was, as I said, a very personal relationship. They didn't talk a lot about politics, and Lem wasn't that interested in the first place. So, but I think Lem and Bobby were certainly friendly through life, and I'm sure he grieved Bobby's death as well. but nothing would have hit him as hard as Jack's death. He became, there was a term for Washington widows, and there were a lot of men, like Ben Bradley and Hugh Sidey, who had just idolized Jack Kennedy and were just devastated by his loss. And Lem was certainly one of them. Yeah.
If Jack Kennedy had survived, do you think the marriage would have survived, or Jackie would have found it intolerable to continue with his infidelities?
Oh, that's a very good question, and something people have wondered about. There is a rumor that at some point in the marriage, when it was particularly troubled, the first years were very troubled, and there's a rumor that Joe Kennedy offered her $1 million to stay in the marriage. I wouldn't have put that past him to offer that, nor would I put past her to take it as sort of combat pay. I got the sense that their marriage improved as it went along, and during the White House years, they seemed to have been partners. But of course, Jack was still philandering, as we now know. I don't know. That's a very good question. I think she would have done whatever was best for her kids. She was very protective of those kids. And very fiercely devoted to them. I see her marriage to Onassis entirely through that prism, as just a way of providing protection for her and the children. So I don't know. She was a woman of her time, right? So I think she might have stuck it out for as long as it took. And she was Catholic. They were Catholic, which made divorce harder, though ultimately a lot of them did get divorced.
Say thank you to Louis Bayard.
Thank you so much.
Let's say thank you one more time to the Hollands and to Morgan Kuhn for sponsoring Louis's visit. Please remember to be generous when you see the volunteers with the yellow receptacles with your donations. They're waiting for you, and Louis will be waiting for you in the Telfair Square tent. Thanks.